And we've been looking at, as Christians, that we need to be able to reach our world, our community, our neighbourhood, our loved ones and our friends for the Lord. And the thing is that we're to go out into the world. We can't expect the world to come into us. They're not going to come to church. We have looked at the confrontational style of Peter, and we've looked at the apologetic style of Paul, and today we want to look at the testimonial style of a blind man. Now you might be thinking, well, Pastor, how do I know what my style is? Well, some questions that a person has asked about this testimonial style that help us is, I often speak about my personal background or experience to illustrate a point that I'm trying to make. I often identify with others by using phrases like, I used to think that too, or I once felt the way you do. I intentionally share my mistakes and struggles with others when it might assist them in considering solutions that could help them. People are always interested in hearing stories about the things that have happened in your life. And you'll be able to tell them how you're still amazed at the work that God has done in transforming your life. And others want to know about it. That's the thing that is the beauty of sharing our faith. We're sharing something that's happened to us, and people want to know. If you have a testimonial style, people who are like this tend to be good listeners, clear communicators rather than compelling storytellers. They can hold the interests of those with whom they seek to communicate, whether those people necessarily agree with what they're hearing or not. And today we're looking at the blind man and his style. And an issue of perspective, and that issue of perspective you'll find in these first 7 verses. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been born blind. His followers asked him, Teacher, whose sin caused this man to be born blind? His own sin or his parents' sin? Jesus answered, It is not this man's sin or his parents' sin that made him blind. This man was born blind so that God's power could be shown in him. While it is daytime, we must continue doing the work of the one who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. Well, I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. After Jesus said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with it, and put the mud on the man's eyes. Then he told the man, Go and wash in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went, washed, and came back seeing. So here we have a situation where Jesus is walking with his disciples, and he sees a blind man. And I'm sure that not only did Jesus see the blind man, but so did his disciples. And they could have asked Jesus a number of questions, such as, how can we help this man? Why is society ostracizing him and treating him this way? What's his story? How can we help him survive in this community? Can you heal him? Lots of questions they could have asked him. But they saw him, this blind man, but they didn't see him. That's interesting. They saw him, but they didn't see him for what he was. From their perspective, they wanted to know, why is this man blind? Is it his fault? Or is it his parents' fault? Is it some kind of sin that he committed that he's blind? You see, they were focused more on the cause than the cure. Now, Jesus wasn't interested in a theological debate discussing the pros and cons of the situation. What Jesus saw was a man who needed to be healed. He doesn't answer the question. No one. He does answer and say, no one's responsible for the situation. The man's not responsible, and the parents are not. There was no sin that caused this blindness. Now, the reason this man was born blind was so that at some point in time, God's power would be revealed in him. And that time was now. So he was born blind for a reason. And the day of reckoning, if you like, the day of healing, the day when it was to be revealed was now. So Jesus goes about healing this man, very different from going to the doctor, but by spitting on the ground, make some mud, putting it on a blind man's eyes and telling him, go to the pool and wash it off. Now, if you're the blind man, what would you be thinking? Would you do it? Would you do what this man says to you? You've been blind all your life. Someone comes along and sticks some mud in your eyes and says, go and wash it off. Would you do it? Would you be thinking, I'm going to be cured. This is what I've been waiting for all my life. Or would you say, nah, I'm not going to do that? Well, you see, the scriptures tell us the man goes off and does exactly what he's told. And then he comes back excited. He's ready to tell everyone he can, I can see. I have been healed. That's my story. And he wants to tell it to everybody who wants to hear it. But you know what? It's important to see. Jesus saw a man that needed to be healed. The disciples didn't see that need. They saw a problem and they wanted to know, why was he blind? It's important we see because it affects what we believe, what we do, and how we live. Jesus saw the need before him. The disciples didn't see the issue for what it was. And so before you and I can tell others about Christ, we must see the need to do so. There are other people out there who need to hear our story. But we need to see these people before we can meet the need before us. Jesus saw this man's situation and saw that he was ready to be helped. And there are people out there, if we pay attention and see them as people and see what they're looking for, we can be available to help them. But we've got to see that need first. And then we see the identity professed. In our verses, it says this. The neighbours and some people who had earlier seen this man begging said, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some said, he is the one, but others said, no, he only looks like it. The man himself said, I am the man. They asked, how did you get your sight? Now, it's interesting. How many people didn't really know this man? From our text, how many people really didn't know this man? You see, the neighbours, you would think, would know who this man is. I mean, he's been there all his life. They couldn't even agree if he was the same man. They thought they knew him as a blind man. But this man was different. He could see. And so they're not convinced that this is the same man who sat there begging day after day, year after year. This man's not the same. He can see. So he can't be the same man. Now that makes some interesting thoughts. I'm sure they would have passed by. I'm sure they would have given him care over the years. But they didn't pay careful attention to what he really looked like. They only saw his blindness, and that's all they knew about him. A blind man who sits there begging day by day. That's all they knew. He was the same person, but all they saw was a blind man. That's all they knew him as, a blind man who begs. They were not convinced it was the same man. They argued about it. And all the while, how would you feel? You're the blind man. You're standing there listening to your friends and your neighbours who you've known from birth through, and they're arguing it's not the same person. How would you feel standing there, listening to this? And I believe he says, look, I am that man. It's me. Open your eyes. Look at me. I am that same man. Now I can see. But the neighbours were not interested in looking. How can this be the same man? Your eyes are open. His was shut. How can this be? You're not the same man. How would it be to prove your identity that you are the one and the same person? These neighbours should have known. But they didn't see. They didn't really know. And I wonder sometimes, do we really know people enough to know what they need? What are they really like? It's interesting. How many married here today? There's a few. Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot. What colour are your wife's eyes? Brown. Are you sure? I was looking. You see, often we take for granted we don't really know the person. Now, I could have asked anybody, colour of the eyes. A lot wouldn't know what colour they are. But how well do we really know people, the people around us? We know of them, we see things about them, but how well do we know them? And then we have what I call an instructive presentation in verses 11 to 17. He answered, "The man named Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. Then he told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." They asked him, "Where is this man?" "I don't know," he answered. Then the people took him to the Pharisees who had been blind. The day Jesus had made mud and healed his eyes was a Sabbath day. So now the Pharisees asked the man, "How did you get your sight?" He answered, "He put mud on my eyes. I washed, and now I see." So some of the Pharisees were saying, "This man does not keep the Sabbath day, so he is not from God." But others, "A man who is a sinner can't do miracles like this," so they could not agree with each other. They asked the man again, "What do you say about him, since it was your eyes he opened?" The man answered, "He's a prophet." What a situation. Here's an opportunity. What does he say? He tells them exactly, "I'm the same person who was blind. But there was this man, and he put some mud on my eyes. He told me to go to the pool, wash the mud off, and now I can see." And that's the gospel truth. That's all there is to it. That's his story. That's what happened to him. And he told it the way it was. The Pharisees, they asked the man, "Well, if that is the case, show us this mystery man. Point him out to me." And the man said, "I cannot. I don't know where he is." And everybody starts looking around to find out where Jesus is. Now, I find that would be so frustrating. You asked me to tell my story, and yet you're not listening to what I just said. You're looking for the man. You're not listening to me. But how frustrating to prove that you are who you said you were among the people who should have known, and yet they don't believe what's right in front of them. You know what? Often that is the case when you and I start telling people our story about how our life was changed by Jesus. They cannot understand it. They do not want to believe what they're hearing or seeing. What do? We know this is the truth. We were there. It's affected us. And yet, these people are not interested. They're not listening. When we give our testimony, it's interesting. From this blind man, they're asking questions. And what did he say to them? "I do not know." Where is this Jesus? I don't know. Where is he? I don't know. And so it's okay to be able to say, "I don't know." to people's questions. Sometimes we think before we have to share our faith, we've got to have everything down pat. We've got to know everything and be able to put it in a box and share it if anybody asks us. This blind man told his story, and when he was asked these other questions, he said, I don't know. I don't know. So it's fine. The people then took this man to the religious leaders to explain what had happened to him. And they asked him to explain once again, what's your story? What happened to you? And I guess these religious people, as they gathered together, I can imagine the noise as the neighbours are all sharing their opinions as to what's happened to this man. And so it doesn't take these religious leaders long enough to see, hey, it's better if we get this man aside and talk to him in private rather than listening to all this person and this person and this person. And so they turn to the blind man and say, tell us your story again. Now you notice this time, the blind man leaves a few things out. He condenses his story. He doesn't mention Jesus' name. He just says, the man put mud on my eyes. And he doesn't say he went to the pool to wash it off. He just says, I washed it off. Just a few details. But I don't know what else they expected him to say about what happened to him. I think he suspected these religious men had another agenda, and he didn't want to be part of that, and that's why he limited his information. And yet these religious men didn't see what was before them. What was their problem? I mean, here's a man that was blind but can now see. What were they interested in? They were not interested in the fact that he was healed. They had another issue that they wanted, another agenda. They wanted to know, when did he do this? And they understood it was the Sabbath. They were only interested in some laws that had been broken. They had already arrived at a conclusion themselves before they'd fully investigated the facts of what happened. As far as they were concerned, this man couldn't be from God, because if he was, he wouldn't have broken the Sabbath laws. And yet this man, this mysterious man, had broken those laws. They knew Jesus had broken the Sabbath laws and made it a big issue in their investigation. Now, to do that, I believe that they must have read every law of the Sabbath and believed that Jesus had broken the law in 3 ways. And as one learned commentator said, has cited how they found him guilty of breaking the Sabbath laws on the day by healing the blind man. This is interesting. First, while it was okay to spit on a rock on the Sabbath, saliva was not allowed on the dirt because making of mud involved work, so you broke the Sabbath. You could spit on it, but you couldn't make it into mud because that's work. On the Sabbath, you broke that law. Second, the rabbis said it was forbidden to heal on the Sabbath. They specifically said if you find someone with a broken leg, you can keep it from getting worse, but you cannot make it better. Too bad if you're the one with the broken leg. They can't heal you. The third thing Jesus did was use saliva. The rabbis did not allow this on the Sabbath because they believed it was medicine, and medicine involved work. Now, let's be a little fair to these religious men. They weren't all in agreement. Actually, our scripture says they were divided in their opinions regarding what had happened. And so they agreed to disagree. It's interesting, when they couldn't agree amongst themselves, they turned to the blind man and say, what do you think about this man? After all, he's the one who healed you. Let's hear your thoughts about what you think this man is. And what does the blind man say? He's a prophet. Now that's a statement for a blind man to make. And I say it's a statement because this blind man in society is virtually a nobody. He has no power. He has no authority to speak. He wasn't even allowed in the synagogue to worship. He wasn't allowed to learn the scriptures because of his blindness. The religious leaders equated his blindness to his sinfulness. He had been cursed because of his disability, and so no religious leader would touch him or go anywhere near him because he was an outcast in their society. And yet, here he is, being asked to express his opinion before them. What an opportunity. And what does he tell them? He tells them something they should have already known. Jesus, a prophet from God, because of what he's done, is a miracle. And he tells them straight. He gives them a sensible answer, which really should have been the end of the matter. No more arguments. Look, I'm the man that was healed. All I know is that I was blind, but now I see. This man, as far as I'm concerned, is a prophet. This is not the answer that the religious leaders are looking for. So they try a different approach because they've come to the conclusion that this man was a liar, and they're intent on proving that he was a liar. They didn't want to lose face in public. So we have what I call is an immediate protest. Oops. These leaders did not believe that he'd been blind. He could now see again. So they sent for the man's parents, asked them, "Is this your son who you say was blind? Then how does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can now see. We don't know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the elders, who had already decided anyone who said Jesus was the Christ would be avoided. That is why his parents said, "He's old enough, ask him." Now, if I was one of these religious leaders, I'd be very frustrated right now because things are not going the way that I wanted them to go. They thought this blind man was playing a game, and he wouldn't tell them what they wanted to know. They're sure they're missing something and were determined to get to the bottom of it. So they decided to call the parents of the blind man. Maybe they can tell us something that we're missing. Yet, they'd heard all the testimony from their neighbours, people who knew him, and yet it wasn't enough for these religious leaders. Now, it's interesting. Neighbours, religious leaders, at this point in time, he told them exactly what had happened to him, and they didn't believe him. Now, when I share my faith with people, guess what? I have people that don't believe what I'm saying. You can tell your story, and yet they will not believe the good news about Jesus Christ. And that's exactly what's happening here with this blind man. He's told them his story. He was the one that was healed. He should know, and they're not listening. They're looking for other issues. And many people will outrightly reject what you have to tell them. They'll refuse to accept anything you have to say regarding your faith. And that's the times in which we're living now. And I remember one particular person at a meeting I went to with this anti-discrimination said to me that we don't care what you do, we want to confine what you say to the four walls of your church, and that's all you're allowed to have. They made it plain. That was what their agenda is. And many people will try to do. I don't want to hear anything you have to say about your faith. I'm not interested. And they'll reject it. So we're going to find that when we do share our testimony and what has happened to us, there'll be people who will reject it. There'll be people who will be hostile and resist what we share, no matter what we say. Now notice the parents are asked two questions, simple questions. Is this your son? Is this your son? Explain to us why he can now see. Now the parents answer and say, yes, this is our son. We know it is, and that should have been the end of it. I mean, you are the parents, you should know who your children are, right? That should have been the end of the matter, but it wasn't. Now in answering the second question, we do not know how he can see. Now, as a parent, would you want to know the story about how your son was healed? How he's blind all these years and now he can see? Do you think you'd do some investigation and find out for yourself? I think they would have, but I think they were lying because they knew what had happened, and yet they're too afraid to tell the consequences of the truth. They're protecting themselves because in verse 22 it says they're afraid of the Jews. And if they said Jesus healed their son, they would face rejection from society. And so they were very careful to avoid anything that would incriminate them. Now one learned expositor says this, and it helps us to understand the background of those times and the culture of the day. The Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed Jesus to be Messiah, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, the parents said, he is of age. Ask him. Why? Because they can't throw him out of the synagogue because he's not in the synagogue. He's never been in the synagogue because of his blindness. So they're saying, I want to ask him. He's of age. Now, being thrown out of the synagogue was a big deal. If you were in Jewish society and you weren't in the synagogue, you were considered a leper. There were three kinds of excommunication, and each one of them had a social implication, it had an economic implication, and it had a religious implication. The first, according to the Talmud, there were three kinds of shamatha, which means destruction. That's considered destruction when you're thrown out of the synagogue. You're cut off from God and the life of the country. Then he breaks it down. There is a nezva, which was, if you were excommunicated, it could be from the range of 7 days to 30 days. In other words, you could be excommunicated from the synagogue and everything that happened in the society for either 1 week or 1 month. You were out for that period of time. The second was nidu, 30 days plus. Now this could be a long time. It could be months, it may be years, depending on the crime. And if you died under the ban, you had no funeral. So, wow. You could understand why, if you're not part of the in crowd and you were dishonored, seriously, by not being allowed to be part of the synagogue, wow. But the worst was harem, which was an indefinite permanent ban. The rabbis used to say that being banned was far worse than being flogged because of its implications socially, economically, and religiously. So you can understand why the parents are a little reluctant to go anywhere near saying, yes, Jesus healed our son, because of the implications. They could be thrown out of the synagogue. And they said, ask him. He's of age. So what did they do? The individual's proof. So for the second time, they called the man who was blind. They said, you should give God the glory by telling the truth. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, I don't know if he is a sinner. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. They asked, "What did he do to you? How did he make you see again?" He answered, "I've already told you and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his followers too?" Then they insulted him and said, "You are his follower, but we are followers of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from." The man answered, "This is a very strange thing. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We all know that God does not listen to sinners, but he listens to anyone who worships and obeys him. Nobody has ever heard of anyone giving sight to a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." Well, all I can see is the parents inflaming the situation now. These religious leaders said to the blind man, and this is interesting, "Give glory to God, because we know this man Jesus is a sinner. So why don't you come clean and tell us the truth, the real truth about what's happened to you?" In effect, they're saying to this man who was blind, "You're a liar. We don't believe what your neighbour said. We don't believe what your parents said. So we want the truth. And we want it now. So we want you to tell us again, what is your story? What really happened? Confess to us and tell us the truth." What would you do in that situation? Now, our text says, "I've already told you once and you haven't listened," as much as to say, "Why should I tell you again? You're not going to listen." But I like the way he deals with the situation. He says, "I don't know whether this man is a sinner or not. But what I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And this is what I know. I'm not wasting my time in useless speculations as you do. The fact is, I can now see. And it was this man that did it. That's the truth, any way you want to cut it. And this is what I know to be true." This man didn't deviate from what he knew. He stayed with the facts. He didn't debate them. He didn't get into arguments. He just told them the truth. Now, these religious leaders, by their own admission, accepted the fact that he'd been blind. They understood that and that he could see, but they wanted to know how Jesus healed you. What did he really do to you? They're not interested in the facts at this point. You'll notice the response. "How many times do I have to tell you? I've already told you what happened. You're not listening anymore. Tell me, why should I tell you the same thing again?" And then he adds with a touch of sarcasm, "Do you want to become his followers too? If you're so interested in my story, do you want to become his followers too? Is that why you're asking me again and again and again?" And I can imagine, "Oh, no, that's not it at all." Now, that would take some courage and boldness, but it shows you the conviction that this man who was blind had about what's happened to him. He understood who healed him. He understood it was Jesus that healed him. He understood more than they gave him credit for, but he stayed to his story. He didn't tell anybody else's story. He only told his own story. "This is what has happened to me. I know it's true." It doesn't sit well with the religious leaders because they've been exposed for their hypocrisy and their own blindness. They accuse him of being a disciple of Jesus while insisting they were a disciple of Moses. We follow the law, and we know this man is a sinner for not following Moses' law. Now, we know with certainty that God has spoken to Moses, but when it comes to this man, we know nothing about him or where he comes from. They firmly believed, they were convinced that he wasn't from God. Now, if I was a blind man at this stage, maybe I would keep my mouth shut. But he kept and challenged their thinking. He said, "Oh, that's interesting. I find that you do not know where this man is from. Yet this man opened my eyes. I can see. Isn't this something that only God can do? Can Satan do something like this?" Ouch. Now I can see this man really getting into it now. He knows by telling his story. And he keeps talking. And he says, we know that God doesn't hear sinners. And we know for a fact that no one has ever heard of a person whose eyes have been shut or blind from birth ever being opened by anyone. Now, those listening would be saying, hey, that makes sense. That really makes sense. And he continues to his conclusion, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. No miracles if we're not from God. So think about what has happened. What have you seen for yourselves? I was blind, but now I see. And that's my testimony. That's my story to you today. Do what you want with it. I've told you the story. Now, it's interesting. These religious leaders didn't take too kindly to being lectured by a blind man, and they drove him away. In other words, they had enough of him and were not going to lower themselves to engage him in meaningful dialogue. When the Pharisees encountered a healed man, what did they see? They saw not a healed person. All they saw was a theological problem that needed to be solved. How can someone perform miracles while breaking religious laws? For them, what someone does on the Sabbath is more important than what suffering and isolation a person endured every day of the year. That's what mattered to them. So when it comes to what we see so little that we don't even know that we're blind. We see so little. Yet we walk around with our eyes open, but we see so little. We assume we're people who see, and we think that we know things. But here's the truth of the matter. We are blind to the people in front of us. We are blind to the needs of others. We're blind to what is most important because we're distracted by things that aren't. We are blind because we can't see the work of God when evidence is standing right in front of our faces, just as it was with this blind man. The disciples didn't see this blind man for what he was. The neighbors didn't see him. The religious leaders didn't see it. Jesus was the only one who noticed this man. He was the only one who saw him. What do we see when you and I look at people in our community? What do we see? People in need, people to avoid, people who've got problems, people to stay away from. The testimonial styles and approach that each one of us can use. It's simply telling others our story about what Jesus has done for us. Sometimes we're afraid to say anything about the Lord because, hey, I might be dragged in some theological debate from which I don't have the answers. We can learn from the blind man who simply says, hey, I was blind, but now I can see. He wasn't worrying about answering questions that he didn't have answers to. He simply said, I do not know, but I'm sure of this thing. I was blind, now I see. And that's the truth. The evidence is before you. And we're the best authorities, the best people to tell others about what's happened in our lives. And when we do that, we can have a positive influence for Christ when we give our testimony. This blind man is so like us. His weakness, in his blindness, in his washing, in his testimony. He had a testimony of what Jesus had done for him that was very simple and yet very effective. When people ask him what happened, I was blind, but now I see. When the Pharisees called him to interrogate him about what happened, they told him to glorify God for what had happened because they said Jesus was a sinner. The blind man said, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. But one thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see. Very simple, very powerful testimony. His testimony was strong, even though, if you like, he hadn't been to Bible college, he hadn't been to a theological training seminary, he had no discipleship training or Sunday school to help him. Under questioning, he knew one thing. I once was blind, but now I see. And that's what Jesus had done for him. A simple testimony, but it confounded the religious experts, and it glorified God to all those who were watching. He didn't know a lot, but one thing he did know. His life was changed and Jesus did it. And that's the story that our world needs to hear. And it needs to hear it from who? You and me. Why? Because this is what's happened to our lives. We've all got a story to tell in a simple way. It doesn't have to be a theological proposition. It's simply telling people, this is what Jesus has done for me, and this is what he means. And we just tell it like it is. That is the testimonial style. That is something that each one of us can do. As the team comes, we're going to sing a